Well, thank y'all for coming out tonight. I am the storyteller of Mount Lebanon, so we shared some things about Mount Lebanon the last time I was here, and kind of narrowing down the focus this time to one of its notorious citizens, I guess you might say. When Jessica and I were discussing which program I might do for tonight, we thought that this one might be timely since 89 million women are registered to vote in the United States, and this is a presidential election year. And tonight I'm going to tell you the story of Lavinia Egan, who was from Mount Lebanon and had an important role in helping women secure the right to vote. I know that we're all happy to get back out and socialize and mingle again because, you know, we went through a really rough patch there for about 2 or 2.5 years, and we were bombarded with all kinds of headlines, and you know, our hospitals were overcrowded with people sick with the pandemic, and it was mandated that we had to wear masks, and people were marching outside the White House trying to get the attention of the president, and people were taken to the streets to be heard about all kinds of social issues. But wait, that was 100 years ago. And we still got those headlines today. But there was one thing that was different 100 years ago was the 19th Amendment was in the works in the midst of all this pandemic that was going on. And the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. It was passed and ratified on August the 26th, 1920. And the women who worked so hard to make this happen, they were somebody's daughter, they were somebody's sister, they were somebody's mother. And I want to tell you that tonight about one of the daughters of Mount Lebanon who was involved with this movement of giving women the right to vote. Lavinia Egan is one woman's story. Lavinia was born in Mahia, Texas. Now, her family fled just before she was born in October of 1863, along with several other Mount Lebanon families, to the Mahia area. If you put it in context, Vicksburg fell in July of 1863, and the Red River campaign up the Red River was beginning to form and take place. So the people of Louisiana were sort of sandwiched in between these federal forces, and they were worried about what their quality of life might be if those forces overran Louisiana. So Dr. Gibbs of Gibbsland fame, and Martin Canfield, who was the father of Mount Lebanon, and the Egans all went to Mahia, Texas. Now, the former president, or the former preacher of Mount Lebanon Baptist Church that I told you about last time, George Washington Baines, he has now retired from Baylor University, and he has moved to this area. So I don't know, the chicken or the egg, if they went there because George Washington Baines had moved to that area, or George Washington Baines came from Baylor up to that area because these families that he was so well known with had moved to that area. But Mahia and Fairfield and Cotton Gin, Texas, were the communities where they settled. Now, after the Civil War, Lavinia's family returned. Dr. Gibbs did not. He remained in Texas, but Martin Canfield and the Egans, they all came back to Mount Lebanon. And she led a fairly simple life as a doctor's daughter in Mount Lebanon until the age of 13, when the Egan family moved to Shreveport in 1876. They had really wanted Dr. Egan, her father, to come during the yellow fever epidemic of 1874, but I guess he was just worried about his family and conditions, so he did not move to Shreveport until 2 years later. Lavinia was the youngest of 5 children, and she was educated in Mount Lebanon and in Shreveport, but she graduated from the Ward Seminary in Nashville, Tennessee in 1890. And Ward Seminary was one of the top 3 institutions for women at this time. So, as with all the other Mount Lebanon families, education was extremely important. So they sent Lavinia to Nashville to the Ward Seminary. By her own admission, she dabbled in drawing and in painting, but her real calling seemed to be journalism. So she began to write for the Philadelphia Times in 1895. Her articles were syndicated all over the United States. If you go to any of the historical newspaper researches and you Google her pen name, Patience Oriole, now how that she came up with that name, I can't imagine, but that was her pen name. You'll find in South Dakota, you'll find in California, you'll find all over the West and the Northeast articles by Patience Oriole. Also, she published her first book, which was a collection of short stories, and it was entitled, today it may seem unusual, A Bundle of Faggots. Now, I gave pause with that title, and I had to go research and figure it out. Faggots was the name of sticks or twigs or kindling. So a bundle of sticks, basically, was the name of this. And you understand maybe why she chose that, because in the preface to her book, she says that this bundle of faggots was to keep her pot boiling as she developed her journalism career. So in some ways makes sense, but it is a lesson. Be careful what you name something, because in 100 years it may have a totally different meaning. So I just want to explain that title. In 1897, she was back living in Shreveport, and with this, it opened up a whole world of service and social issues for Lavinia. She was president of the Hypatia Club, and it was organized in 1894, and it's the oldest women's club in Shreveport, and it was and I love this expression, its purpose was for intellectual development and social stimulation. So she was president of this. It really was a literary club that began to concern itself with social issues and gave women a voice in civic affairs. It was a part of the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And in 1903, she was the first president of the City Improvement League of Shreveport. Now, the issues that this league addressed were public parks, grounds of public buildings, tree plantings, parking, education as it relates to civics and industrial education, cemeteries, libraries, restrooms, girls' homes, children's free kindergarten, and other charitable endeavors. Now, I have to let my imagination run wild here. You know, the courthouse in Caddo Parish, this is the third courthouse. If you look at pictures of the second courthouse at about this time frame, you see these little bitty trees that are planted around the courthouse. So you kind of wonder if this City Improvement League might have been responsible for planting of all those oak trees around the courthouse in Shreveport that we so enjoy today. I worked downtown Shreveport when I was in college in the summers, and I just loved the courthouse and the oak trees and all. So you have to think or have to wonder. Now, Lavinia's life was interspersed with travels. She traveled a great deal. She traveled to Mexico. She traveled to Europe, all through Europe, Great Britain, and all the while she was the travel correspondent for the Philadelphia Times and occasionally for the Shreveport Times. And in the summers, she was the Philadelphia Times correspondent for the Jersey Shore. Cape May, New Jersey was the hotspot of social news in the Northeast. And this is Cape May. So she would write the social correspondence, and I can just imagine the things that she reported on. Well, at last, Lavinia was ready to step onto the national stage of service and employment. So, December of 1903, she was elected the secretary of the Board of Lady Managers for the St. Louis World's Fair, which was to be held in 1904. Her salary was a whopping $150 a month, which was very good, I think, for a woman at that time. Now, I have to give credit here to Lester Martin. This is Lester's original book from the Board of Lady Managers of the World's Fair, and this picture is from this book. So Lester has a real treasure there in having that original bound book. Now, what did she do with the Board of Lady Managers, or why did this Board of Lady Managers exist? The idea of giving the exposition visitors social pleasure would be a new concept. Before, the World Expositions had been focused on trade and industry and all the things of that nature. It was believed that sociability promotes trade, and trade promotes wealth. Boy, did Louisiana hang its hat on that theory with all that they have done to promote Louisiana internationally. But that was a new concept, and I just find that interesting that should be a new concept for them. The Board of Lady Managers was formed to help the prominent women of St. Louis with their social affairs and the entertaining. Now, there are accounts of Lavinia handwriting as many as 600 invitations to one social event. So she, as secretary, did a lot of correspondence and invitations to the affairs. In fact, there are accounts of her hands swelling up so from writing out the invitations that she had to have a little respite. But now, some of the things that this daughter of Mount Lebanon experienced at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, or as it was known as the St. Louis World's Fair, we find amazing today. Wireless telephone and radio transmissions, early fax machines, X-ray and infant incubators, electric streetcars, 140 models of personal automobiles. Now, how many automobiles are we down to now? Maybe about 10. The food court concept was introduced. Dr. Pepper, puffed wheat, waffle ice cream cones, and the song, Meet Me in St. Louis, Louis. But probably one of the most influential elements that she was exposed to through this World's Fair was the idea of the modern woman. Charles Dana Gibson was an illustrator for national magazines, and he sketched his wife, and he gave the world the concept of the Gibson girl. The Gibson girl was athletic. The Gibson girl was a free spirit. And we can see that the Gibson girl of the 1890s through the 1900s was really at its height of popularity in 1904. Everyone around Mount Lebanon always said or commented that Lavinia wore mannish clothes. But I think she found her style with the Gibson girl, and she just kept it for the rest of her life. Because as you can see, you know, the suit coat, the shirt waist, all had man tailoring details. And I think we can appreciate this because we all probably know someone from high school that is still wearing their high school haircut. You know, they found that style they like and they just don't want to give it up. But by May of 1904, I don't know if it's because her hand is hurting from all these invitations, but Lavinia starts to express strong opinions on women's affairs. All of this is beginning to emerge. She said that women's columns in average newspapers were filled with plaudits and platitudes, pie crust, and pudding. That no woman is fit for the ballot or for equal rights with men as long as she permits women's columns of that accepted type. She said that we need to clear out all the receipts, or as we know, recipes were called then, frivolities, and let it express the woman's point of view. Ooh, Lavinia was off and running with a new passion. By 1918, she had an appointment by the Secretary of War as a clerk for $1,100 a year. She reported to the office of the Director of Military Aeronautics in Washington, D.C. Lavinia wrote semi-technical articles and news stories for the Air Service newsletter and publicity for the War Department from 1918 until 1921. During her time in Washington, D.C., she couldn't help but notice these women that were standing outside the White House every day. They were known as the Silent Sentinels. They stood outside the White House every day from January 1917 until June the 4th, 1919, protesting to President Woodrow Wilson and anybody else that might pass by about women's suffrage. I'm sure it got pretty cold out there on the streets, but they were determined. Well, I guess Lavinia just couldn't stand it. She was never one to sit on the sidelines, and she plunged headlong into the women's right to vote. On May the 21st, 1919, the House of Representatives passed the 19th Amendment. And in June, the Senate passed the amendment. So the race was on for ratification. They had to have 2/3 of the 48 states to ratify this amendment so that it could become the law. And as soon as her duties with the War Department ended, Lavinia was elected a member of the governing board of the National Woman's Party in February of 1920. Now, the National Woman's Party was one of several considered to be the most radical of all the women's suffrage groups. It was headed by Lavinia's friend, Alice Paul. So Lavinia began traveling the states in pushing for ratification, and this photo of Lavinia was her press photo that would appear in the papers prior to her appearances in cities and communities where she would be speaking on behalf of ratification. Her home state of Louisiana must have been such a disappointment. Louisiana rejected the 19th Amendment on July the 1st, 1920. But Louisiana became the 46th state to belatedly ratify the amendment in June of 1970. You read that right. 1970. They got around to ratifying the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. But listen, they were not as bad as Mississippi. Mississippi was the 48th state of the original 48 to ratify it in 1984. So thank goodness we didn't have to rely on the states to get us the vote. Now, just by comparison, I want to show you the ratification map for prohibition. Notice Mississippi jumped on board with number 1 for prohibition. And I can't imagine in Kentucky with all that bourbon that they were the 3rd to ratify prohibition. But even Texas at 8, and we finally came in at 14. But that was how it shook out for prohibition. At last, August of 1920, it came down to Tennessee. I've listed for you here all the states in their order of how they ratified the amendment. So we're down to Tennessee, the 36th state that we need for this to become law. There was a young 24-year-old man by the name of Harry T. Brown. Harry had planned in Tennessee to cast his vote against ratification. But the morning of the vote, he got a letter from his mother. His mother admonished him to be a good boy and to vote for ratification. So she changed his mind. He voted for ratification. Now, does that saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, might apply here? That vote of 1 gave the right to vote to 8 million women that November of 1920. The Republican Warren G. Harding defeated Democrat James M. Cox in a landslide vote. So women now have finally been able to cast their ballot. But the fight was not over. Lavinia continued traveling and speaking to champion the next phase, which was the Equal Rights Act of 1923 that her friend Alice Paul had drafted. Now, I'm into body language. I just have to point this out to you. Notice prim, proper ladies, all feet planted on the ground, our ankles slightly crossed. There's Lavinia kicked back. Over here we have all these nice prim ladies with their feet on the ground. Even Alice Paul have their feet on the ground. Once again, Lavinia, kick back. So I just thought that was interesting body language, that even as the way she sat, she had to be a rebel, with or without a cause. Now, even though we have this right to vote, it was important for women to understand that they still needed equal rights. Now, what did that equal rights mean? That they would have the right to hold office, that they could have their choice of domicile. No longer could their father, their brother, or their husband dictate where they could live. They could acquire, inherit, control, hold, and convey property. They wanted the freedom of contract so that they could borrow or loan money. They could have custody or control of their own children rather than a husband or another male relative having that control. And that they should suffer no legal or civil disability because of marriage. Now, this is one that hit close to home to me, and some people may just follow through with that and not truly understand the implication. My mother, as a young lady, unmarried, worked for the Bienville Parish Health Unit. She loved her job. She went with the doctors and nurses all over Bienville Parish when they held typhoid clinics. Mother's responsibility was to record the births and the deaths of the parish. Well, that was all well and good, and she loved her job, but she also loved my daddy. She and Daddy got married November of 1941, and she had to resign from her job because married women could not have jobs. And that just blows my mind. So she had to make a choice between my daddy or the health unit. Fortunately for me today, she made the right choice, I hope. But you know what happened? In just a month, December 7th, 1941, we had an abrupt beginning to the U.S. entering World War II. And as we all probably grew up referring to it, as the Shell plant came into existence, and they were clamoring for women, whether they were married or single, to go to work out there at the Shell plant. So just a flip of circumstances, all of a sudden married women could be employed. So I've often thought how sad that must have been to her to have to give up a job that she loved so. So by 1923, at the age of 60, Lavinia returns to Mount Lebanon and buys the former president's home of Mount Lebanon University. And with her usual flair, she renames it Wayside Cottage. And Lavinia was able to vote for the next 25 years before her death in March of 1945, if she had that $1 for poll tax. Finally, the poll tax in Louisiana was abolished in 1934, and people could vote freely then. Now, the president's home in Mount Lebanon, Wayside Cottage, is one of our buildings that's on our National Register of Historic Places. It was built for Jesse Hartwell to entice him to come be the president of Mount Lebanon University and the pastor of Mount Lebanon Baptist Church. Here we have it. Oh, well, where did I go all of a sudden? Apologize. Well, I'm about to the end of it anyway. The it had fallen into a state of great disrepair. And I guess I lived in Savannah and Charleston enough years and heard the stories of all the ladies that stood in front of the bulldozers to save Charleston. Well, I was determined that I wanted to, save Wayside Cottage because it had such historical significance. So our Mount Lebanon Historical Society acquired the property, and we're in the process of trying to not restore it, but to salvage and maintain, what we have. So that was Lavinia's home when she came back. I would add one postscript. Lavinia was eccentric even in death. Now in the South, we use a more loving term. We would just say that she's peculiar. But she directed her nieces, Miss Willie Colbert and Miss Mary Jones, and her young cousin, Miss Doll Artis, to prepare her body for burial. And she was laid to rest in the Mount Lebanon Cemetery at sunrise, servants as her pallbearers. That closed an era that began in the Civil War and ended in World War II. And they say that little poem about the dash, in between the day you were born and the day you die, there's a dash. I would say that Lavinia made the most of her dash. Well, thank y'all for your attention this evening. I appreciate it. And if you have any questions, I might try to answer. So, ladies, remember Lavinia when you go to the polls in November.
Especially with what we got now.
Well, men say that all of our troubles started when women got the right to vote, but...
How's the